everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. This is part 2 of the Christie Marceau case, so if you have not seen part 1 yet, it is linked in the description box. You should probably watch that first, or a lot of this isn't going to make sense. In part 1, we went over who Christie Marceau was and who Akshay Chand was, and how their paths crossed, leading Akshay to believe that Christy was his rock, his sounding board, his best friend, the only person he could consistently complain to about his depression, and the only female in his life he really felt comfortable expressing these feelings to. However, even though Christy wanted to help, she soon realized that she wanted Akshay to get better a lot more than he himself wanted to get better. And although she had pleaded with him multiple times to seek out mental health help, he had failed to do so, deciding instead that he wanted Christy, who had her own life, to be his full-time mental health counselor. When Christy began setting boundaries and putting some distance in between herself and Akshay, after several incidents that made her feel uncomfortable, Akshay took this personally and he became angry with Christy, wanting to get revenge on her for turning her back on him. He did this by luring her over to his house, holding her at knife point, and forcing her to undress. Christy was able to escape and report what had happened to the police, but eventually Akshay was released on bail, even though what he had done was horrible, and even though he lived within 5 minutes of Christy. But before we dive into the details today, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV. Most of my regular viewers already know why I love Magellan TV, and today I want to talk about a film I watched this week called Body Snatchers of New York, which it's crazy, first of all. And it tells the story of a man named Michael Mastromarino, who I guess initially started a legitimate company, like a tissue harvesting company, but after being corrupted by greed, a tale as old as time, Mastromarino spun out of control and he began illegally harvesting tissues from like funeral homes and corpses in New Jersey and New York. And in late 2005, the NYPD began investigating Mastromarino and his company for selling human tissue to tissue banks. It was estimated that he was making $20,000 per body, but he was only paying funeral homes $1,000 for each body, and when all is said and done, Mastromarino had made millions. The death certificates, consent papers, medical histories, those were all forged to make it seem as if the donors had agreed to this before they'd passed. It's truly a story of modern-day body snatchers. It's shocking, it's terrifying, it's horrifying, and I think it's a story that really hasn't been reported on enough, but it's important to understand and realize that even after you're dead, you aren't safe from the evil people in this world. And new documentaries just like this are being added to Magellan TV every single week on top of the 3,000 documentary films and series that are already available there. They have a great true crime collection, which you can get started on after you watch Body Snatchers of New York, because I really want you to watch it. Luckily, viewers of this channel can take advantage of Magellan TV's special offer, which is a 1-month free trial. All you have to do is click on the link in the description box and start watching, especially with summer being over now, which is sad, but here we are. It's getting colder out. It's getting darker earlier. We're all going to be spending a lot more time inside, so why not watch something that's not only educational, but entertaining as well? Click on the link in the description box, start your free trial today, and thank you so much to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Let's dive in. Akshay Chand was released from prison on bail on October 6th, 2011. And when Tracy Marceau, Christy's mother, told Christy that her attacker was out, both of them were understandably upset. Tracy wrote in her book about Christy, quote, "Then and there, her spark seemed to extinguish as she tried to understand why she was to be put at risk. My bright little bubble of joy slowly withdrew into a world of fear. She put on such a brave face to try to stop us from worrying so much, and my heart breaks as I only now realize that she tried to protect us from her true feelings of terror. I truly admire her courage and unconditional love for us in doing that. I don't think a mother could ever ask for what Christy gave so selflessly." End quote. So Tracy's not blowing smoke here. She's not like, oh, she pretended to be brave and it's only now I realized that, she was a lot more afraid. Tracy's not making this up. The reason that not everyone involved with this case, but some of the people closest to the case are aware of how truly terrified Christy was after this attack, and especially after Akshay got released on bail, is because she wrote about it in her journal. Now, these journal entries have never been made public. They've never been revealed. Both the courts and Christy's parents agree that Christy deserves to have that one last scrap of privacy. They were her private thoughts. She never intended for them to be read by anyone else. So pretty much the only people who read it, they read it after her murder, and they only did so to understand the gravity and to understand the depth of her actual fear. And I mean, credit where credit is due. These courts in New Zealand, they did make mistakes as far as letting Akshay out on bail, but I respect this decision. Of course, Christy's parents knew that they all had to be on their guard and protect Christy in the event that Akshay still had revenge on his mind. Christy's father, Brian, even considered leaving his job so that he could stay home 24 hours a day and watch Christy until Akshay went to prison. But he'd only been working at this company for about 5 months. The family needed his income, and taking, a month off, it wasn't going to be something that the company would allow. The police were also surprised and dismayed that Akshay had been let out, and they let the Marceau family know that although this decision had been out of their hands, they were going to do everything in their power to keep Christy safe. The police sent patrol cars to drive around Christy's neighborhood several times a day, and all staff were given a photo of Akshay, as well as his description, as well as the description of his charges, so that they could keep an eye out for him, not just around Christy's neighborhood, but all around Auckland. Law enforcement also made a point of checking on Akshay at his mother's apartment several times, randomly, and sometimes more than once a day. The lead detective, Detective Watson, he said later that they did this because it was important to show Akshay that he could be checked whenever, wherever, and as many times as was needed. So it would keep him on his toes and he'd be less likely to stray from his bail regulations and rules. Detective Watson also said during these checks that there were no red flags. Each time the police knocked on his door, Akshay answered the door and presented himself in a manner that was courteous, cooperative, and polite. Akshay's mother, Suchita, she made sure to take the kitchen knives in the apartment and she hid them in what I guess she believed was a safe place. Suchita told the police, quote, "Whenever I left the house, I would put all the knives in a compartment under the oven. There's a panel that comes off, but to look at it, you wouldn't know. I would put the knives behind the panel when I wasn't home, and I would bring them back out when I got home. At no time did Akshay ask where the knives were, and I have no idea if he realized I was hiding them. Obviously, I was concerned about what he had done to the girl previously, but I thought he had learned his lesson. Over the last couple of days, before the girl got killed, I had been forgetting to hide the knives." End quote. Akshay's 16-year-old sister was also scared of her brother and what he was capable of. She said, quote, "I knew what he had done and it terrified me. I remember putting even the small knives away. We did this because we were both scared about what he might do. I took every opportunity to stay at friends' houses so I didn't have to be at home." End quote. Akshay's mother, Suchita, had taken her son to doctor's appointments twice after he was released from prison, and he'd been prescribed an antidepressant called citalopram, the same antidepressant that he'd been given in prison. At the beginning of November, just a few days before Christy's life would be taken from her, Suchita brought Akshay back to the same doctor because she felt that her son's mental health had been declining, and apparently the doctors agreed, at which point his dosage of this antidepressant was increased. But when Akshay went home, everything was pretty quiet for the most part. He was there whenever the police checked. Christy and her family hadn't reported anything strange or disturbing, and by the time November rolled around, it seemed like they would make it to Akshay's November 9th trial date without an incident, and his lawyer had already indicated that Akshay would be pleading guilty So it should have been smooth sailing. Christy and her mother were going to be leaving Auckland and moving to Australia in early January. Akshay would most likely be behind bars at that time, and life could go back to being normal and good. On Sunday, November 6th, Christy's father went back to Australia for work, and Christy and Tracy went to brunch. Christy insisted she wanted pancakes, so they went from cafe to cafe until they found a place that served them. Christie Marceau remembered her last happy day with her daughter, saying, quote, "We sat and ate our brunch while we eagerly made plans. We were both so happy that morning. Brian and I had promised to take Christy to see the pandas at the zoo, and she was busily telling me that she would be wearing her panda hat. A text came through to remind her about meeting a friend that afternoon, and she told them she would be along later as she was having brunch with me. I still see her showing me her reply and saying, 'Mom, I love you.' This was the last time we said this to each other while she was alive. The next time I uttered the words, 'I love you' to Christy was as she was dying in my arms. The memory of that Sunday is what I try to focus on, that last special time I was granted before she was taken away from me by a selfish, dangerous creature. I did not realize that I would never have another day. The memory of that last brunch is the memory I hold dear. That was my beautiful Christy." End quote. The next morning, Monday, November 7th, Tracy got up early because she was working that day. Christy was still asleep when Tracy woke up at about 5:30 a.m. because Christy wasn't scheduled to work until 11 a.m. Tracy herself had already eaten breakfast, let the dogs out, and showered, and she was just about to get dressed for work when she heard the doorbell ring. Tracy wasn't necessarily surprised by this early morning visitor. I guess Christy was big into online shopping, and she ordered a lot of stuff online, and her packages were usually delivered early in the morning. But when Tracy opened the door, she did not see a delivery man holding an Amazon package. She saw a young man that at first she didn't recognize. She said he looked very different. It was Akshay Chand, holding a knife that he had managed to steal from his kitchen, unbeknownst to his mother, who had been trying to hide them specifically for this reason. Akshay had woken up that morning with a plan. It had been 32 days since he had been free from prison. 32 days that he'd been respectful and polite when the police showed up at his apartment. 32 days that he had been pretending he no longer had an axe to grind with Christie Marceau. This had been a carefully crafted plan. In 2 days, Akshay would be going to trial, and he would most likely be sentenced to time in prison, and while he was in there, Christy was going to leave New Zealand, and he would never have a chance to make her pay again. He had waited 32 days so that Christy and her family would grow complacent and begin to believe that maybe he was no longer a threat to them, but that was the opposite of the truth. Akshay woke up the morning of September 7th. He got dressed, he brushed his hair, and he placed the kitchen knife and a hammer into a bag. The hammer was a backup plan, something he would use if no one answered the door when he arrived and he had to force his way in, because nothing was going to stop him from seeing this through. Akshay walked out of the house with no one to stop him. His mother was at work and his sister was at school. On the short walk to Christy's house, Akshay popped in his headphones and listened to the song Up on the Ladder by Radiohead on repeat. The song is a raw and angry ballad about disassociation, disappointment, and disillusionment. According to Genius.com, the song ties in Radiohead's obsession with being trapped in space and compares it to living a normal, middle-class life in a poorly run society that doesn't care about you. The song's lyrics go on to say, quote, "All the right moves in and in the right places. Watch me dance. I'm a puppet. You can almost see the strings. Give me an answer, give me a line. I've been climbing up this ladder. I've been wasting my time. Up on the ladder, trying to call out your name. Up on the ladder, you're all the fucking same." End quote. These were the lyrics pumping into Akshay's brain as he made his way to find the one person who he had felt was different, who he had felt was special. But in the end, in his mind, she was just like everyone else. Christy didn't love him, just like his parents didn't love him. Christy didn't care about his mental health, just like his family didn't care. Akshay rang the doorbell and waited, and when Tracy answered the door, he pulled out the knife, and before she could react, he pushed past her into the house. Tracy said that at this point, she screamed, and she screamed Akshay's name, hoping that maybe one of the neighbors would hear her, hoping that the scream would wake Christy up, And Christy would hear Akshay's name and be aware and have a warning of the danger that awaited her. Maybe she could run and escape. Tracy said Akshay flashed the knife at her and asked her who else was inside the house. And thinking quickly, Tracy told him that her husband, Brian, was home. But Akshay, he seemed kind of amused by this. And he was like, that's not true. And that led Tracy to wonder if maybe Akshay had been watching them for some time, tracking the movements of their family. Now, Christy did wake up when she heard her mother scream, but she'd been asleep. So the scream simply pulled her from her slumber. She hadn't specifically heard Tracy yell Akshay's name. You know when you're sleeping and then a loud noise wakes you up and then you wake up and you're all disoriented and you don't know exactly what the loud noise was that woke you up. You just know something woke you up. That's what happened here. Christy walked from her room to the top of the stairs. She was rubbing her eyes, wearing sleep shorts and a thin tank top. You know, she's disoriented. She's out of it. When she saw the scene that awaited her, Christy began screaming as well. She was so shocked, she froze. She just kept repeating, oh my God, oh my God. I mean, can you imagine this traumatized girl, what she went through with him, what she went through when she found out that he was going to get bail? And this is probably a scenario that's played over in her mind over and over again. It's probably a scenario that's played over in her dreams and her nightmares. Him just showing up at her house. And now she wakes up and he's there. There's going to be this shock. There's going to be this disbelief. There's going to be that question in your brain like, is this real? Or is this just the same nightmare I've been having over and over again for weeks? Akshay went for Christy, and he firmly planted his foot on her chest and kicked her hard, knocking her down the stairs. In her book, Christie Marceau said, quote, Christy tumbled down the stairs, but managed to get up and run through my mom's flat. He quickly took after her, and then blind panic hit me. I knew I couldn't overpower him, so I got to the phone and called 111. That's New Zealand's 911. Stupidly, I thought that it would be like the kidnapping. He would just frighten her, and the police would get here in time. Judge David McNaughton had let this guy out because he didn't deem him a risk to Christy or the community. So I truly believed I could get the police there quick enough to help her. End quote. Now, I know that there are, amongst the subscribers and viewers of this channel, there's a split issue on gun ownership. A lot of people think that nobody should own a gun. A lot of people think that you should own a gun for self-defense. Some people are hunters. I don't own a gun for hunting. I would never kill an animal, ever. So that's not what I'm about. But if that's what you're about, all the power to you. I'm not going to judge your lifestyle or tell you what to do or not to do with the one life you've been given, right? But this is where having a gun comes in handy, because Tracy saw this man with a knife chasing her daughter, kicking her daughter down the stairs. Christy's running for her life. He's pursuing her. And Tracy says, I know I can't overpower him, so all I can do is call the police. And even if they're responding very fast, if Akshay was there to kill Christy, they're not going to get there in time. This is where having a gun for self-defense comes in handy, because it is the great equalizer, especially as a woman. It doesn't matter how strong you are. You're usually not going to be as strong as a man. That's just biological, unless you're a bodybuilder, and then you'll probably be stronger than most men, but still, it's the great equalizer. If Tracy had a gun, if she knew how to use it safely, she wouldn't have had to think, oh, I can't overpower him. She wouldn't have had to have depended on calling the police and waiting for someone to ride in on their white horse and save her and her daughter. She could have just gone after him. Boom, boom, done. Okay, threat neutralized. You may disagree with me. You may think that it's cold-hearted, etc., but when it comes down to it, if you're in my home and you're trying to harm my family, you are not safe. And personally, that's exactly why I own a gun and why I know how to shoot a gun. Not because I enjoy it, not because I'm like, ooh, having a gun is cool. But if somebody comes in here with the intention to harm me or my family, they're not leaving alive, period. Disagree with me if you want. That's okay. We can still be friends. If we all thought the same, the world would be boring. Christie Marceau had barely given the address to the police operator when she heard a scream. It was Christy's scream coming from outside. Christy's grandmother, Shirley, had been asleep in her bed when Akshay showed up, and later she told the police that she had woken up to the sounds of both Christy and Tracy screaming. She said they were wordless screams, anguished screams that were horrendous to hear. She got up and ran to the hallway in time to see her granddaughter running down the stairs, slipping and falling down the last few. Shirley saw a man, Akshay, running after Christy holding a knife. He was only 2 or 3 steps behind her. Christy had run outside with the hope of escaping through the garden gate, but Akshay was on her, and he was stabbing her before she was able to unlatch it. When Tracy heard Christy scream, she dropped the phone. She ran towards the sound. Tracy described these incredibly devastating and traumatic moments, saying, quote, "I ran to the garden and saw Christy lying on the deck. He was still standing in our garden, but I didn't care. I ran to Christy because that was all that I was concerned about. I cradled her in my arms and just kept telling her to hang on and that I loved her so much. I couldn't see any marks or injuries on her front, and I couldn't understand why she wasn't moving. I only found out afterwards that the coward had stabbed her in the back. I just hadn't been quick enough in calling the police. I hadn't done what I was supposed to do. I hadn't protected her. I led her to believe that everything was going to be okay, and she believed it. She really believed it. I kept trying to bring her round and telling her help was on the way. I suddenly looked into her eyes and actually saw the life drain out of her. I screamed that it should have been me. My angel died in my arms, and I could do nothing to bring her back. I don't think the human brain is prepared to cope with such trauma. When I realized she had gone, I looked up at him, and he was still standing there with a smirk on his face. I looked at his hand as it still held the knife and realized the evil monster had stabbed her again and again until the knife was useless. The blade was at a 90-degree angle, and he couldn't have hurt her any more if he had tried. I screamed at him that he had killed Christy, and I will never forget the words that he said, coldly, clearly, and flatly. I am glad. I yelled at my mom to get the neighbors, but she was hesitant to leave because she thought he would harm me too. I just didn't care at that stage, to be honest. I wanted to be with Christy. And if I could be, then let him kill me too." End quote. Christy had been stabbed multiple times. I believe it was about 15 times, all from behind. The first stab had been to the back of her head, which had knocked her down. And then Akshay had proceeded to stab her so many times and so hard that the blade of his kitchen knife had bent. After he had done this, Akshay put his headphones back in and stood calmly, watching as Tracy and then Shirley rushed out and gathered Christy in their arms, crying over her and begging her not to die. Christy was lying in a fetal position on top of a pool of her own blood. When Shirley reached the deck, she checked for a pulse, and when she found none, she looked up at Akshay, who was still holding the knife, still smirking, and yelled, "Why are you here? Christy never did anything to you." To which he responded, "You just don't know." Christy's grandmother, Shirley, said that Akshay seemed like a zombie, relaxed, as if he didn't have a care in the world, and he made no moves to run away or escape. He just stood there, waiting for the police to arrive. Within minutes, the police and paramedics had arrived to find Akshay Chand covered in Christy's blood, just chilling on the deck and listening to music on his iPod, the same song, on repeat, up on the ladder. A police officer cautiously approached him, and the police officer was like, "What are you doing here?" To which Akshay responded, "Reprisal." Reprisal, for those of you who don't know, and I don't think you're stupid, but maybe some of you don't know, reprisal means an act of retaliation. An act of retaliation, right? Which suggests that Christy did something to him that he had to counter-strike. It suggests that he feels legitimized and validated, knowing that what he did was instigated. When this same police officer asked Akshay why his hands were shaking, Akshay said, quote, "It's not easy to kill someone," end quote. Really, dude? Because you made it kind of seem like it was easy. Like, you made it seem like it was really easy. And when her mother said, "You killed her, she's dead," you said, "I am glad." Christy was obviously dead by the time the paramedics examined her. The police convinced Tracy and Shirley to wait at a neighbor's house while they processed the scene. There was media there, they were already trying to get pictures of Christy, pictures of Akshay, like everything was just a madhouse. And once at the neighbor's house, Tracy made 2 difficult phone calls. One to her husband, Brian, who was working in Australia, and one to her daughter, Heather, to tell them that Christy had been murdered. Heather and Heather's boyfriend, they came right over. Obviously, Brian would take a little bit longer to get there. Tracy kept reliving those last moments when her daughter had died in her arms. I'm sure to this day, she continues to relive it. She said that she saw Christy's thumbnail had been pulled off because she had fought so hard. She was trying to get that gate open. She was trying to claw herself away from Akshay. And Tracy felt that Christy had been trying to say something to her. She'd been trying to tell her mother something before she died, but she'd passed before she could. Tracy said that Akshay showed no remorse. He showed only satisfaction. She said, quote, "All I can see, all I will ever see is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping, covered in blood, and just dying for some pointless reason. He just stood there and watched it. He didn't even try to get away. What sort of person is that? I don't know whether he envied the fact that we had such a great, tight-knit family and he didn't have that, but he knew that we loved our girls and still do, but he's taken one away." End quote. The lead detective on Christy's case, we've talked about him before, Detective Watson, he was not on duty that day, but he'd stayed in contact with the Marceau family, and he happened to just be in the office when the call came in that said there was a stabbing nearby. He didn't put two and two together. He just kind of drove to the address, and he didn't realize that it was Christy until he pulled up to the house, the same house he'd been driving by all month, checking on Christy, making sure that Akshay wasn't creeping around. Looking back on the moment that he realized his worst fears had come true, Watson said, quote, "I went down the driveway to where Christy was, and that's when I saw that she had been killed. It was a shocking thing. I've been to a few homicide scenes, and very rarely do you get to know a victim to any degree prior to them being killed. Obviously, on this occasion, we'd met. We'd caught the person responsible for the kidnapping, and we tried to do as much as we could to protect her. And then here we find her covered in blood, deceased at the back of her house. When I first saw her, I was in disbelief, really. I had to go and check that it was Christy." End quote. And it really is admirable when a law enforcement officer takes the time to actually get to know the person that, he's supposed to protect and serve, right? It is admirable when there is that relationship, not too much of a relationship to where it becomes unprofessional or where his vision gets blurred, but enough of a relationship where he feels protective over this young girl. He knows what she's been through because he took her statement. He knows how terrified she was, and he wanted to keep her safe. That's what a police officer should want to do. And that's really what happened here in this case. The Marceau family have nothing but glowing and amazing things to say about the police force that helped them not only after Christy had been abducted, but through the trial, after she was murdered. They still keep in touch. They're still friends. Every time they see each other out and about, they give each other hugs. This is community policing that we really should have and we really should see everywhere. Akshay Chand was driven to the police station, and during the short ride, he started talking to the police officer who was behind the wheel of the car. The police officer said that Akshay was very nonchalant and conversational, like they were just driving to see a movie or something. Akshay was like, what political party do you support? Who do you vote for? What kind of music do you like? Just as Akshay pulled away from the Marceau home in a squad car, his aunt pulled up, and I guess she had heard from his mother what had happened. And she said, she just needed to see for herself that it was true. Like, what do you mean? If my nephew or my son had abducted a girl and held her at knife point in his apartment and threatened to rape her and say he was going to get revenge on her, I'm not going to have a hard time believing that he actually followed through on the things that he said he was going to do. But what do I know? Detective Watson, he said he brought in what he called a large gazebo to cover Christy's body. Now, I don't think it's a gazebo like I think of a gazebo. A gazebo to me is like a big wooden thing. It's like a big wooden structure, and you can go in there and it's kind of covered, and it's not super like portable. But I think in this case, maybe he means like a tent, like a crime scene tent. And he brought that in to cover Christy's body. to protect her from the prying eyes of the media, who, like I said, already were gathered outside the Marceau home. Vultures, I hate them. And also to protect her body from the weather because she was outside. And a crime scene outside is very hard to keep under control. And he wanted to make sure that everything was sort of like isolated and separated while the forensics team collected blood samples and fingerprints. At the police station, Akshay was first given a medical exam, and they were like, all right, you're healthy, at least physically. And then he was read his rights before he met with a lawyer. He was then interviewed by Detective Darren Atwood. And this is what Akshay said, quote, I woke up at 6:30 a.m. The first thing I did was get out of bed, brush my hair. I went to my closet, which had my bag and, of course, the contents. He means the knife and the hammer. Mom hid all the knives, but I guess I was one step quicker than her. I put the knife in the bag a week before. Of course it was premeditated. I sneaked out. My sister was still in bed. I listened to Up on the Ladder by Radiohead. Tracy opened the door. I pulled the knife out. She was extremely shocked, as you can imagine. She started screaming. I advanced. Christy was on the stairs, starting to panic. I kicked her down them. She got up quicker than I would have anticipated, and she ran. I stabbed her in the head, and she fell on the deck. I stabbed her a couple more times. The knife became twisted. It became clear that I couldn't use it anymore. I backed off and stood there for a while. Tracy ran in. She told Christy that she loved her and everything was going to be all right. End quote. All right, so hold on. You mean to tell me that Akshay's mother, Suchita, had been hiding the knives, right? She said she hid them before she went to work every day. And then she brought them back out after she got home from work. Why are you bringing them back out? Why are you bringing them back out? Why don't you just keep them hidden? And if you really need a knife to like cut an onion or something, then pull it out of the secret compartment. Why are you going through this whole process of hiding them before you go to work and then bringing them back out? And then how did you not notice that one of them was missing for a week when you were hiding them and taking them out and etc.? Because he said he took it a week before and he had hid it in the bag. How did you not notice? Like when your son is a violent person who's threatened to stab somebody and has threatened to get revenge and stab her and murder her, don't you think that like just maybe count the knives before you put them away so you can make sure they're all accounted for? Like maybe take a little bit more due diligence when your son is a violent person who's already been violent and wants to be more violent. I don't know. Just my opinion. I'm trying not to judge. I just feel like more should have been done, you know? Akshay also told the police that he believed the song Up on the Ladder had been written specifically for him, and he wanted to know if the cops thought he was going to be on television. And then when they were like, why do you ask? He's like, I'm just curious. Akshay also made a shocking statement. He said, listen, yeah, you've caught me, but my work's not over because I have a female accomplice on the outside, and this woman is going to continue killing. Actually, there's 2 more people who are going to die. So this interview was recorded, which Akshay was told, but when Detective Atwood left the room, Akshay began doing some bizarre behavior. He was making like strange faces. They said he was like pulling faces, kind of like, I don't want to do it, it's so weird, like, you know, like making weird faces, and then he was like fixing his hair, smiling, having a grand old time messing around, like looking at himself in that 2-way mirror. Overall, Akshay's confession shook the law enforcement officials who'd listened to it. These were grown men who had seen some things in their careers that would curl your hair. But hearing Akshay bring them step by step through this horrible thing he had done, so matter-of-factly, to say something like, of course it was premeditated, it was very disturbing. Detective Watson said, quote, from an investigator's point of view, it's good to get someone responsible for a crime confessing to it and telling us details we didn't know before. Chand told us what his activities leading up to it were and explained what he had done. But the other side of me was sitting there, listening to a man who's just stabbed a young girl several times and killed her, and explaining this in a way that seemed like it hadn't really happened. I didn't see any remorse, I didn't see any emotion, and it was quite a difficult thing for an officer to sit there and listen to. End quote. Akshay said that he felt zero remorse for Christy because she deserved to die since she'd let him down. When Brian Marceau got the call telling him that his youngest daughter was gone forever, he was sleeping because he was 2.5 hours behind New Zealand time. When his phone rang, he answered it, and he heard his wife say, she's gone, he's done it, he's killed her, she's gone. Brian got on the next flight to Adelaide, and then he took a direct flight to Auckland. Later, Brian would give an interview to the New Zealand Herald where he said, quote, they say that when you lose your parents, you lose your past. But when you lose your children, you lose your future. end quote. Brian felt an incredible amount of guilt that he hadn't been there when Christy had been held hostage by Akshay, and he hadn't been there when Christy was murdered by Akshay. He also talked about how Christy had just completed therapy, extensive therapy, a week before she died. She had gone into therapy because of what had happened with Akshay and being abducted and held as, like a hostage in his apartment for an hour. And a week before she died, she completed this therapy. And she made a poster in therapy showing that she was a survivor and not a victim. And she brought it home. She was proud of it. She hung it up in the living room. She felt that she had reached a milestone, like a place where she could start moving forward. And not only Brian, but Tracy, Heather, all of Christy's family felt an incredible amount of guilt, of course. And that is survivor's guilt, but it also has a lot to do with the fact that it happened in their own home, the place where you should feel that your family's protected the most. The morning that Akshay was arrested, he was put in front of a judge again, but this time on a murder charge. The police quickly filed another opposition to bail document just to be safe, especially since the police were still under the impression that Akshay's female accomplice was an actual person, which, spoiler alert, she was not. We'll get to that. Everyone thought once again that this would be a pretty cut and dry case, right? Akshay had kidnapped and attacked Christy. He'd lied to everyone in order to get bail, and then he'd bided his time before finally taking her life. There had been multiple witnesses, and he'd confessed to everything, even to it being premeditated. But then Akshay's lawyer let everyone know that he was planning to plead not guilty by reason of mental insanity. A week after Christie Marceau was brutally murdered, her family laid her to rest. There were over 150 people in attendance, many of them who had never known Christy but wanted to give her a proper send-off. All the cops from the police station were also there, the police officers who'd fought so hard to keep Christy's attacker behind bars where he wouldn't be given the chance to hurt her again. There were too many people there to even fit inside the church. After Akshay Chand had kidnapped Christy and she'd survived it, she'd spent some time talking to a good friend of hers, a close friend of hers, because she felt she'd come close to death. And so it made her start thinking about things that 18-year-old girls usually don't think about, like what happens when I die and what kind of funeral would I want. And Christy told her friend that she wanted a funeral that was going to be like a happy occasion. She didn't want, everyone dressed in black, everyone crying. She wanted a funeral that would show who she'd been in life, not focus on her death. She wanted it to be a celebration of her life, and she didn't want people to cry or be sad. She wanted them to have fun. That's exactly what I want for my funeral, by the way. I want it to be a big party, lots of booze, lots of music. Make sure you guys make that happen. I'm counting on you. Because my family's Italian, and Italians are really big into their Catholic church funerals, where the more you cry and the more black you wear, that definitely means you really cared about the person. And I mean, hours of mass and lots of sad organ music, some faceless, bodiless voice coming from the rafters singing a song in Latin, lots of tears. In fact, my uncle died about a month and a half ago, and I wore red lipstick to his funeral, and I got a lot of shit about it from my aunt. Apparently that's unacceptable. No makeup to a funeral. The sadder you look, the worse you look, the more you loved the dearly departed. So make sure my funeral's a party. After Christy's funeral, faced with the finality of her really being gone forever, her family turned their attention to making some changes that would obviously not be able to save Christy, but hopefully might save others. They began questioning the New Zealand bail laws, and Christy's law was suggested just after the government announced a number of proposed changes to the bail laws. One of these changes was a reverse burden of proof in bail applications for people charged with murder or serious violent or sexual offenses. So basically, instead of it being up to the police and the prosecution to prove that this person should not be given bail, it would be the responsibility of the person charged with the crime, and they would need to prove that they were not a risk to the community. Christy's law didn't just focus on bail reform, however, but also on judicial accountability, which to me is way more important. Under Christy's law, judges who make the wrong decision or a decision that ends up costing a life or further harm to the victim or the wider community, that judge will be held accountable for those decisions. Police would also be given discretionary power to veto a judge's decision to grant bail, and that doesn't mean that the person just doesn't get bail. It means the case moves up to a higher court, different opinion, etc., and the words and the feelings of the victim would be given more weight instead of the offender's feelings, because a lot of people who were involved with this case and many others, I mean, in this book, there's case after case after case of families who have lost loved ones because somebody who was a violent offender who was out on bail decided to kill them. So these people think that, yes, obviously, before somebody is deemed guilty in a court of law, they're innocent, they should be given rights. But if the evidence is overwhelming that this person did commit this crime, if they've confessed to it like Akshay did, then you really need to be taking the victim's feelings into account more than the offender's feelings. I have some stats here, which are kind of crazy. In New Zealand, between 2006 and 2010, 23 people were convicted of murders that they committed while out on bail. 21 people were convicted of committing homicide-related offenses while out on bail, including manslaughter and attempted murder. 7,146 people were convicted of acts intended to cause injury, like an assault. 1,132 were convicted of abduction, kidnapping, false imprisonment, harassment, nuisance, or threatening behavior, and 763 people were convicted of sex offenses. All of these numbers I just gave you, all of those people were out on bail when they did these things. So they were arrested for a violent offense, and then they were given bail, and then they went out on bail and continued to violently offend. A woman who was working on Christie's law, I can't remember her name right now. I feel like it was Susan or something. I'm so sorry, but she's working on Christie's law. She points out that even though it's called Christie's law, there's so many other families who have lost loved ones at the hands of those who have been released on bail. And in August of 2012, the Law and Order Select Committee heard verbal submissions from those who were advocating for the law, not just the Marceau family, but so many other families who were in the same position. And Christie's sister Heather spoke, saying, quote, "I just want the bail laws to be changed. I know that nothing will bring my sister back to me, but because of the way they are, I had to walk down the aisle without my sister in front of me. Now I have to face every day without her. If people knew how difficult it was to cuddle an urn or a photo, I don't want anyone to have to feel the way I do. There are so many people that have gone before Christy, and I feel like we're standing up for them too, and victims that will come next. No one should have to lose a family member. Not like this," end quote. So when Heather's saying she had to walk down the aisle without Christy in front of her, it's because Heather got married after Christy died, and Christy was supposed to be her maid of honor. So on September 27, 2012, Akshay Chand appeared in front of the High Court at Oakland, and he was not there for his murder charges, but for the kidnapping of Christie Marceau from the previous September. And he pleaded guilty to all 3 charges. It was during his murder trial the following month that the world would finally be introduced to Pauline, an 8-year-old girl, an 8-year-old British girl, I guess, whose voice Akshay claimed he heard in his head, and Pauline had told Akshay to kill Christy because Christy was the devil. Pauline apparently had been a former classmate of Akshay's from Wales, so remember he lived in Wales for a while, for like a year, and that would have been right around when he was 9 or 10, and he considered it the happiest time of his life. So he's suddenly hearing this 8-year-old girl's voice, even though at this time she wouldn't be 8 years old anymore. Now, Akshay's lawyers said that when Akshay had first spoken to mental health experts after his initial arrest for Christie's kidnapping, he had been hearing Pauline's voice, but he denied having any hallucinations or delusions because he needed to keep Pauline a secret, even though he'd been hearing her voice consistently since January of 2011. Even though Akshay was telling everyone he was fine and he was not psychotic, I mean, he insisted on this. Remember, when he met with the original mental health experts, his lawyer, Marianne Lowe, began exploring an insanity defense, and she hired Dr. David Chaplow in February of 2012. Dr. Chaplow was one of New Zealand's leading forensic psychiatrists, and he'd been the National Director of Mental Health for the Ministry of Health for 10 years. Marianne Lowe brought Chaplow on to assess Akshay Chand and to let her know if there was any hope for an insanity plea. And Dr. Chaplow sat down and talked to Akshay twice in 2012, once in March and once in April. According to Dr. Chaplow, in just that 1 month's time, there was a dramatic change in Akshay because he had started taking antipsychotic medication between the 2 interviews. Akshay told Dr. Chaplow that the voice in his head, which at first he told Dr. Chaplow was named Lorelei, this voice had become more insistent and louder after he'd been imprisoned for the kidnapping of Christie Marceau. The voice got louder and clearer in the mornings and at night, but then at other times during the day, he would just simply hear humming or singing, like constantly. So during the first interview, Dr. Chaplow asked Akshay why he'd broken bail and gone to Christie's house to kill her, to which Akshay responded, "No, that wasn't me. It was the voice in my head. It's got a lot of control over me. It's got an incredibly strong hold on me. And I thought initially that it was a girl named Lorelei, but eventually I realized that it was this girl, Pauline. And Pauline told me that I had to cut off Christie's ears and stab her eyes out." Akshay said that he knew killing Christy had been morally wrong, but he felt compelled to act on what Pauline had told him to do, and he had struggled against it for as long as he could. But on the morning he got up to kill Christy, he could no longer resist it. But then after being on antipsychotics for like a month, Akshay met with Dr. Chadlow again, and now he claimed, no voices. It's crazy. I'm no longer hearing voices. I'm good now. Everything's fine. And bonus, he couldn't even remember the details of the murder he committed, only the events that happened afterwards. Akshay did, however, remember that the voice of Pauline had also instructed him to kill Christie's family. Dr. Chadlow said, quote, "He told me that people had been having conversations in my head. He told me that the voices had told him to kill Christy. He became concerned about these urgings, and he was so scared that he did not trust himself. He explained to me that the voice became particularly intense several days prior to the killing. He did not divulge this to anyone at the time." End quote. During the first interview, Dr. Chaplow said that Akshay had shown no remorse, but in this second interview, Akshay told Chaplow that his biggest challenge in the future would be to live in the knowledge of what he had done. Instead of Dr. Chaplow concluding that Akshay was lying about hearing voices in order to plead not guilty due to mental insanity, Chaplow concluded that Akshay had actually been lying to all the other medical professionals that he'd seen before Chaplow, and he'd lied to them about not having hallucinations and delusions. But even though he said he wasn't having them, he was. Chadlow used the change in Akshay between the March and April interviews to illustrate this because he had responded positively to antipsychotic meds and because he was saying he wasn't hearing voices anymore. But what if he's lying now, right? So if Dr. Chadlow is going to say that Akshay lied about not hearing voices to other mental health professionals, what if he's just saying that he's not hearing voices now so that you think the medication is working? Dr. Chadlow said, quote, "It is likely that he has a schizophrenic-like illness. Very few persons with such illnesses kill others. However, some with an undeclared and untreated illness may follow command hallucinations insightlessly and injure others." End quote. Dr. Chaplow basically said that when Akshay had kidnapped Christy, he was not mentally ill, but when he killed her, he was. When the prosecution got this report, they were like, okay, well, Chaplow's a good chap. He's a good chap. Chaplow's good. He knows what's up. He seems to have a good handle on this psychiatry thing. So let's get another expert in here to verify this stuff. So the prosecution brought in Professor Graham Millsap, who specialized in psychiatric disorders. Like Dr. Chaplow, Millsap was given all the case notes and court paperwork. He was also given interview footage and Dr. Chaplow's report. And he interviewed Akshay himself in July of 2012. So it just gets worse. It gets weirder and weirder. Millsap said that Akshay had become aware of the influence of Lucifer, otherwise known as the devil or Satan. And Akshay thought that Lucifer was trying to haunt him, and Lucifer had possessed Akshay's father and taken the form of his father. When Akshay started working at the Countdown supermarket, he began to believe that Lucifer had now possessed Christie Marceau and had taken on her form, because that was what Pauline had told him. When he killed Christie, he said he'd believed that he'd done the right thing because he was exacting his revenge for all the devil had done. And that was why he hadn't wanted the police to know about Pauline, because then they would have stopped him from taking out the devil. Millsap said that Akshay presented with the classic A's that would oftentimes characterize a schizophrenic: ambivalence, affectivity, which means he had a flat, indifferent affect, autism, which made him self-centered and incapable of empathy, and associativity in his thinking, which meant he would sometimes hold incompatible and conflicting thoughts in his mind. Professor Millsap's conclusion was as follows, quote, "In my opinion, that disorder is still present to a significant degree. The evidence available suggests to me that his disorder was so significant and pervasive, and some of the psychotic phenomena so specific to his actions on November 7th, that in fact he did not know at that time that what he was doing was morally wrong. His apparent overwhelming indifference to the perspectives, feelings, and interests of Christy are consistent with that. It is my view that at the time of the crime, Chand knew the nature and quality of his acts. The degree and severity of his disease of the mind meant that he did not know what he was doing was morally wrong when he stabbed and killed Christy. I agree with the opinion of Dr. Chaplow that on November 7th, on the balance of probabilities, Chand met that criteria for legal insanity, end quote. So Akshay's telling Dr. Chaplow, yes, I know what I did was morally wrong. But then this other doctor comes in and he's like, I don't think he knew what he was doing was morally wrong. So it's just very contradictory. After hearing these mental health experts essentially say that Akshay Chand could not be held responsible for his brutal murder of Christie Marceau because he had not been in his right mind and he was a paranoid schizophrenic, the judge found Akshay not guilty and said that he should be detained in a secure mental health facility until the Minister of Health was satisfied that he could be reintegrated into society. While he was a patient at the Mason Clinic, Akshay was allowed visitation from family members. He could watch TV. He was even taken out for leave, like little trips. He went to places like McDonald's. And this is actually where the Marceau family spotted him one day. And they were like, what's going on? They were outraged, of course, because this man killed their daughter. He was found not guilty. He's in like a mental hospital, but he's got field trips that he can go to. Field trips where they can actually run into him and see him. And they'd been told that they would be notified if Akshay was ever let out on leave, but apparently due to a loophole in the Victims' Rights Act, the family would only have to be notified if Akshay was let out unaccompanied. It's kind of crazy. Like, I get it. Like, if he's accompanied, what threat does he pose? But he's a crazy person, right? Who stabbed Christy to death just because he, A, wanted to and he was mad that she had turned her back on him, or he thought she was the devil. Either way, this could be a person who might turn on the person who's accompanying him, kill that person, and then go after the Marceau family. Because remember, the voice told him that he was also supposed to kill Christy's family. So I understand why they're upset. I understand why they're worried and scared. In 2017, there was a coroner's inquest into the death of Christy. And during the inquest, Sergeant Rona Stacey told the court that she had not been given a chance to outline the police position on bail because Judge McNaughton had seemed disinterested in the law enforcement concern around Chand's bail. So Stacey said that she had tried to give new evidence to the judge before the hearing, which included a transcript of Akshay's police interview as well as a map showing how close he lived to Christy. Stacey had been under the impression that both of these details had already been explained to the judge, but apparently they hadn't been. They'd been explained in great detail to Judge Barbara Morris, the initial judge who had refused the bail, but apparently Judge McNaughton hadn't been completely brought up to date by the prosecution and everything, so Stacey was instructed to hand all her information directly to His Honor once the matter was called to court. Stacey testified, quote, "When the matter was subsequently called later in the day, it became immediately apparent from the content and tone of His Honor's remarks that His Honor had moved beyond the issues that had been raised by the way of police opposition to bail. His Honor was now focused on Mr. Chand's treatment and the ability of the mental health services to manage him at home on strict bail conditions. I was not given any opportunity to outline the police position on bail, although I knew the court was well aware of the police opposition to bail and the reasons for that opposition," end quote. Later, they're going to try to make it sound like there was some sort of multi-system meltdown, like it was the police and it was also the mental health people and it was also the judge and it was everybody. But really, the judge, Judge McNaughton, should have probably read the former decisions on this case, decisions made by Barbara Morris, before he went and, made a decision himself. He should have done his research and made sure he was completely up to date and aware of every small facet of this case, because somebody's life is in danger. He didn't do that. And then he wasn't interested when the police wanted to show him this stuff. By the way, Judge McNaughton has never spoken publicly about this. He's never responded to it. He's never said anything about it, so probably best for him. Dr. Ian Goodwin, who was one of the first psychiatrists to talk to Akshay after Christy's kidnapping, he also testified at the inquest. About Akshay, Goodwin said, quote, "He is the perfect example of a psychopath. He is extraordinarily deceptive. One has to be very, very careful what he tells you," end quote. Not only did Goodwin initially interview Akshay, but after Akshay was sent to the mental health facility after sentencing, Goodwin began treating him there. Dr. Goodwin felt that during Akshay's first interview with him, the 18-year-old had misled him purposely, claiming to have remorse and regret and understanding that he could not go around physically harming others. After Christy was murdered, Dr. Goodwin realized that Chand had calculated and deceived a number of people, including himself, in order to achieve his goal of murdering Christy. A forensic nurse who also treated Akshay after Christy's kidnapping testified that she had felt rushed to complete her assessment, that she really needed like an hour, but they only gave her a half an hour, and her report had not been completed in time to be presented to Judge McNaughton, so he never saw it. Her report said that Akshay was not scrambled, not speeding up or anxious, not worried. He was very logical and on track with questions he was asked. He had not been disorganized in his speech, thought, or behavior. After 20 weeks of testimony, the coroner, her name was Catherine Gregg, she expressed her sympathy to the Marceau family, and she released a 130-page report which made recommendations to the police, the Ministry of Justice, the Corrections, and the Health Board. Most likely, nothing will happen because of her suggestions, but, that's just me being bitter and jaded, and I don't trust anybody. Coroner Catherine Gregg, she claimed that she believed Akshay had been properly diagnosed for psychosis, even though no evidence of his disorder had been found by any of the mental health staff he'd seen before the murder. He'd been seen over a dozen times. After the report was released, Christie Marceau told a radio show, quote, "There were many hands on that knife that day. I can't forgive them for that, and I never will forgive them. They can do what they want and try to hush things up, but at the end of the day, they've got to live with what they did." End quote. She's talking about the court system. They have to live with what they did. I agree. The Sensible Sentencing Trust believes that the inquest, which should have been focused on bail reform, and not only that, the accountability of the judge, Judge McNaughton, who'd made the wrong decision. They said that instead, quote, "The inquest essentially blamed multiple systematic failures and neatly avoided an actual person being wholly or even partially to blame for the decision to grant bail." End quote. So is the question here, was Akshay actually schizophrenic? How long had he been schizophrenic? Is that the question? Is the question, was he lying about it? Is the question, should the mental health professionals and the court picked up on that sooner so that they could have known to keep him behind bars because he was unstable and he was dangerous? I don't know what the question is. I would like to ask you guys what you think. I am no mental health professional. I am never, ever claimed to be. And I am sure that there are so many of you out there who know so much more about it because I don't know everything. In my personal opinion, though, after going through this case, there's a good chance that he's faking it, right? There's a good chance that he's not hearing voices at all. During those 32 days he was out on bail, where the police were going there every day, sometimes twice a day, they said no red flags. He's acting completely cooperative. He's polite. He's calm. If it was as bad as he said it was, he said all the voices got so much worse after he went to prison for the kidnapping. So they're still going to be bad at this point. And he said that while he was out, they were just like the voices, or the one voice, the little girl voice, which is weird, was like telling him, you got to kill Christy. She's the devil. Wouldn't he have shown some sort of strain when the police came? Wouldn't he have shown some sort of maybe he looked exhausted, maybe he wasn't sleeping, maybe his mother would have been like, yeah, dude's been acting a little crazy. I hear him yelling in his room, shut up. Wouldn't there have been something that would have set off a red flag if it was as bad as he made it seem? And 32 days, he got out of prison and he went to kill Christy. 32 days between that. He said the voices were really bad to the point where he just, had to give in. Did he resist the voice for 32 days? Because it seems more like he just took those 32 days to let Christy feel safe and also to be out longer because he knew his trial was coming up just a couple of days later after he killed Christy, so he'd be back in prison. So he probably didn't want to kill her right after getting out because he knew he'd be right back behind bars. So maybe it seems more as if he wasn't resisting the voice of a little 8-year-old girl telling him to kill people, but maybe he was just biding his time, make Christy feel safe, and also enjoy his last days and weeks of freedom because he knew once he killed her, he was probably going to go to prison for life, even though that's not what happened. And like I said, no one ever heard him freaking out or screaming. He said that the voices were strongest in the morning and at night, but then throughout the day he would just hear humming and singing. You'd think somebody who was dealing with that for an extended period of time would just snap at some point and yell, stop talking, or stop singing, or I'm trying to sleep, or I don't want to kill anyone. You'd think that would happen at some point. And so his mother, her sister, his aunt, or somebody would have heard it or seen it, or even while he was in jail being held in custody and he said the voices were getting so bad, wouldn't he have just started ranting and raving in his cell, leave me alone, I can't do anything, I'm in jail. Nobody heard anything like this. Nobody saw anything like this. And if he's so out of control, because the voice is controlling him and the voice has such a strong pull over him, if he's so out of control, he wouldn't have been able to resist kind of pushing back. And he wouldn't have been able to really keep it together enough to convince the police or to convince the original mental health experts that he spoke to that he was just fine and he wasn't having hallucinations and delusions. But once again, I don't know exactly how schizophrenia works. I don't know exactly what kind of symptoms or how common these symptoms are. I don't know a lot of that. So let me know in the comment section. I'm always open to learning more. And when he confessed originally to kidnapping her and when he confessed after to murdering her, he said he had murdered Christy because she had let him down. But then later when he's talking to Dr. Chaplow, he's like, yeah, I murdered her because she's the devil. And you can't blame me for that, right? I agree. There's like some bad reasons to murder people, but if they're the devil, that's a good reason, right? So how did it switch? How was it the same story for so long, over a year, that she had abandoned him in his time of need, that she wasn't there when he needed her, and he wanted to punish her for that and get his revenge? But then all of a sudden, no, that's not the reason that he went after her. He went after her because she was Lucifer. Lucifer can't walk around and live, right? I have a feeling, and that's really what sticks out to me the most. His story was, for the longest time, a story that made sense. He was a sad, lonely kid. He was struggling with depression. He thought he found somebody that he could connect to who would be there for him, who would finally care about him. And when she turned her back on him or, set healthy boundaries and put some distance between them, he felt betrayed. That's understandable. Not that he would go and kill her and try to exact his revenge, but the feeling of feeling betrayed and feeling alone again, understandable. It seems like a much more plausible motive than you're hearing a little 8-year-old girl in your head telling you that Christy's the devil and you have to kill her. Also, Akshay said when he was talking to Dr. Chaplow, I believe, the voices are so strong, I don't trust myself at this point. I can no longer hold back. I no longer trust myself. Well, if you didn't trust yourself and you knew that killing someone was wrong and you knew that the voice was telling you to kill someone, Christy, why wouldn't you have sought help at that point? Why wouldn't you have gone to the police or mental health professionals, the multiple mental health professionals that you were forced to see constantly and be like, you know what, I actually do need help and I don't want to hurt anybody. And in this lucid moment where I am in control of my feelings and my thoughts, I want to tell you that I hear voices, something's going on, the voice is telling me to do horrible things. Please help me because this good person, Akshay, who knows that it's morally wrong to kill somebody, I don't want to kill somebody. You'd think that would happen, right? But it didn't. I am looking forward to hear what you guys have to say about everything in the comment section. There's obviously so much more to this case, but this would have turned into a 3-parter and, on and on. There's so much more. It's very sad when you start reading about all the people, all the victims and all the victims' families who have suffered because the bail system and the court system and the prison system, it really does suck. We've got a lot of people in prison for stupid things like possession of, marijuana or possession of drugs or breaking into a house. I'm not saying break into a house, right? But when you look at it, it's probably more imperative that we fill our jail cells with violent offenders, people who kill, rape, murder, maim, attack, people who prey on others. That's probably more important. And I do 100% believe that if you are arrested for a violent crime, such as trying to rape somebody or murder somebody or threatening to stab them while you hold them hostage in your living room, you're probably not super stable, and it's okay for you to stay behind bars until your trial. And then once your trial comes, if your attorney puts up a good argument, that's the wheels of justice. That's how they turn. If you are guilty and you still end up getting out after a trial, it sucks. That's the way it goes. We can't always control that, especially in a jury situation. But what we can control is not letting offenders who have already offended back out in the street to offend again while they're waiting for a trial for the first offense or the second offense or the third offense. So there does need to be some sort of guidelines. There does seem to be some sort of reform here. We have the same problem in the United States. Probably worse. I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but probably worse. You wouldn't believe the amount of news stories I see pop up every day because I have multiple news apps and I get notifications where convict awaiting trial, shot father outside a store, a convenience store, while 2-year-old son looked on. Stuff like that. It's especially if this person knows that they're guilty, especially if they know that once they go to trial, they will be going to prison for a very long time, if not life. They're gonna go out on bail and they're going to turn up. They're gonna act the fool. They're gonna do whatever they can to get it out of their system before they know they're going to prison. Because what else is gonna happen to them? You've got nothing to lose at that point. I'm already going to prison. Once I go to trial, it's a wrap. So why don't I just go out here and, tear shit up? That's the mentality of some of these people. So we have to really recognize that. And I know everybody wants to look at everyone and say, oh, I see the good in you. Oh, I'm sure you're just misunderstood. Oh, I'm sure something in your childhood happened to make you this way. But at the end of the day, it matters. But it doesn't, right? It shouldn't matter as much as the innocent people who are being victimized by these non-innocent people. So we really have to find like a happy medium and a good balance where everybody's rights are being respected, but the victims' rights are being respected and heard and listened to more. All right, that's it. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Don't forget to share it if you think it's worth sharing. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to check out my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I host every week with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. We go over different cases. We are now working on a long multi-part series about Scott Peterson and Lacey Peterson, as Scott Peterson is up for an appeal, and he might be getting a new trial. At that point, if he does get a new trial, anything could happen. So we are going back over the case. We're kind of crowdsourcing. We want help from our listeners. So go and check that out. Links for everything are in the description, including my social media. Come be a part of my Instagram family. We have some crazy times over there. I've talked enough. Thank you guys so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.
The battle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's killing you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.